South Africa marked 30 years of democracy this year. In 1994, the country closed the door on apartheid after 46 years and entered a new system of governance under President Nelson Mandela. But the cracks are showing with mounting challenges. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
1994 changed the course of South Africa's history as a new era of democracy began with President Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress won the first democratic elections. Duduzile Hadebe put her life on the line in 1976 for a just education during the Soweto uprisings. She was beaming with pride as the first multiracial election took place.
We are very happy if when we want to go to the election, that election will make change in South Africa, freedom, that we call freedom.
Hadebe was among millions of hopeful South Africans who voted for a better future, but those hopes have dwindled over the last 30 years.
You don't have a freedom without economy. You can't drive a car without petrol. For example, petrol is increasing every day. And if the petrol is increasing every day, also the food going up. Everything is going up. And most of the people, they are not working.
Duduzile lives in Lawley Township. A lack of investment and big industry here has limited opportunity.
I feel heavy because there's no jobs, there's no resources, there's no stuff. But then I still have hope that things will change, you know. Things will change. Things we'll get through this. It will get better for us all.
Many feel the ruling party delivered empty promises.
We need a lot of things. We need houses, we need water, we need electricity, we need a lot of issues to be solved.
We need to be able to go and feed ourselves. We need to be able to do things for ourselves, you know, as young people or even in middle age, you know, we are most suffering.
Democracy has given South Africans a voice and allowed them to live freely. There's also been significant progress in addressing service delivery and housing needs, but more needs to be done to reduce challenges such as unemployment, poverty and crime, which affects millions of South Africans every day. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town.
Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts, all joining us via Zoom. From Johannesburg, Chris Hatting, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Also in Johannesburg, Professor David Monyae, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. And in Mpumalanga, Prince Mashele, Executive Director, Center for Politics and Research. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining in our discussion. I want to start off with you, Prince Mashele, because South Africa is celebrating 30 years of democracy. Let's start by reflecting on the past 30 years. Can you give us a background on what has happened and what you consider the most significant achievements of South Africa's democracy?
Before 1994, there was no democracy in South Africa. In other words, all the citizens of the country didn't participate in an election before 1994. There was a government, a minority government of white people. All black people were excluded from constituting such a government. So over the past 30 years, black people have been able to constitute successive governments. That is massive. There are many countries in the world that actually don't enjoy that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Two, black people economically were excluded. There were certain jobs that were reserved strictly for white people. So by virtue of being black, you would not be allowed to occupy certain positions, whether in the state or in the private sector. Black people were treated as laborers in the mining sector, going underground, and even their educational opportunities were restricted. So opportunities have opened up over the past 30 years. There is a palpable black middle class in South Africa today that was not there before 1994. Mm-hmm. So black people have gained freedom widely, even economically. But this does not mean that there are no challenges. There are still millions of blacks who live in poverty. There are still millions of black people who are economically excluded in the sense that they don't have education, they don't have skills,
right?
They cannot occupy jobs in the middle class. But overall, I think South Africa has made good progress over the past 30 years.
Chris, let me get your view here.
I think especially since from 1994 to about 2007, 2008, there was substantial progress, not just in terms of the elements of strengthening and introducing in the very first place democracy, the rule of law, rights to Black South Africans that were denied those rights for centuries before then, things like property rights, being allowed to operate any business that they might want to, being able to live wherever they might want to. There was progress in that regard, especially from 94 to about 2007, 2008. Now you had the rising of living standards, more substantial GDP growth on average, people's average quality of life did increase. But from about 2007, 2008, we've had a bit of a stalling in that regard in many areas. In some areas, indeed, a reversal of that. For example, the amount of electricity produced, access to safe drinking water, the elimination of pit latrines and pit toilets. All of those sorts of things, access to housing, we haven't seen that sort of substantial progress compared to what it was between 94 and 2008. And I think you're seeing this in terms of your average South African citizen feeling frustrations with the status quo, not feeling included in economic activity, a lack of economic opportunities. In 2007, 2008, we had about 14 million people in employment. As of 2023, we had around 16 million. So the addition of only 2 million people to that employment figure in all those years. So then you ask questions about macroeconomic policy, government policy choices. Are those, even though you've got the framework of democracy and the security of rights, various rights across the board, right, are we making the right sort of economic choices where the majority of South African citizens can benefit from those particular democratic rights and the strengthening thereof?
So, Professor Monya, that's where I want you to pick it up from, because there is a perception that there now exists an economic apartheid. So what were the basics about in 94? Did the government overpromise and underdeliver?
I think the government has done extremely well, as my colleague have alluded to. I think on paper, South Africa, starting with its constitution, it is considered as one of the best in the world. However, I think the biggest challenge was having the elite pact, where the previous government, the nationalist government and the liberation movement led mainly by ANC, agreeing to a new constitution and the elections. That part of exercise was successful, seeing the transitions that were made in the 30 years. I think the largest part of that was to democratize the economy, to ensure that the majority will share similar rights as minority in the past. I think that has been the biggest challenge. But another important element is the international dimension of transition. I think in the past, you had a white minority devastating the region, playing a destabilizing, bombing neighboring countries. In the last 30 years, the democratic South Africa has managed to work quite positively in bringing peace and stability within its own region, on the continent, and being a notable player at a global level, balancing the Western world as well as the Eastern and other countries that were isolated in the past.
So, Prince Mashele, I think I would like you to answer this question for us, though, because Chris alluded to the fact that things seem to have stalled since 2007, 2008 in terms of living standards for the people. What is that about?
It's a combination of few things. Number one, the governing party, the ANC, has not done well in educating Black South Africans. So the reservoir of unskilled blacks has expanded since 1994, even though alongside that there has been an emergence of a black middle class. So creating jobs for millions of blacks who are not educated, who are not skilled, has been a big problem. So that's the first factor. The second factor is that the ANC overall has mismanaged the South African economy. So over the past more than 15 years now, the South African economy has been struggling even to touch 2% of annual growth. It has not been able to do so. Why? Because the levers of the state that are supposed to facilitate economic growth and sound economic management, such as state-owned companies that provide electricity, ESCOM, or those that transport our mineral resources for export purposes, such as Transnet. Those companies have been mismanaged, and that has had a negative impact on the whole of the economy. Therefore, the economy has not been able to absorb more and more Black South Africans.
So, Chris, you know, South Africa has struggled, as Prince Mandela says, to even achieve a 2% economic growth in the past years. But despite that, though, South Africa remains remains actually Africa's most advanced economy. So what are some of the fundamentals, though, that have kept South Africa as one of Africa's largest and most sophisticated economies?
If you look at the sectors of manufacturing, broadly industry, if you look at construction, but also in the last couple of years, the growth of the financial services sector, South Africa is pushing quite well in that regard, a very developed financial services sector, many banks, a very well-run central bank in the form of the South African Reserve Bank. But of course, those sectors are perhaps more sort of traditionally high-skilled or higher-skilled areas in terms of also education. So if you can't expand education in your areas like agriculture, like mining, maybe like manufacturing and construction, then you're going to run into problems in the long term because you're not creating substantially enough jobs for the majority of the population. So South Africa in the past has done well in exploiting its raw materials for export. But of course, if your basic trade infrastructure, like your ports, if you don't have reliable electricity, you can't export as much as you could have. You don't have as many job opportunities. And of course, your tax revenue suffers. So there's more pressure on the fiscus. You can't spend on those areas like education, other areas that are vital for transforming the economy, for uplifting the majority of people who don't have the opportunities that some others might do. So I think it's quite a complicated economy at the moment. There are lots of opportunities and numerous risks, as I'm sure we're all aware of. So we'll see if the next government can maybe identify some real priority areas and not try and solve everything at once and maybe try and bite off more than it can chew.
So biting off more than it can chew, because Professor Munyai, a recent Ipsos poll showed that 23% of registered voters believe that the country is moving in the right direction. But another 2/3 think that the country's current direction, which is about 66%, the current direction of travel is wrong. What do you see as some of the missed opportunities over the last 30 years?
That in 1994, while there was a transition from apartheid to democracy, at the global level, you also had a transition from the then Soviet Union, United States, and the Cold War at the end of that era into a much more unipolar, US-led. And therefore, I think what the ANC government, in my own personal view, made a huge blunder in terms of confining itself with this view that there's no alternative. And therefore, it limited its policy prescripts within IMF, World Bank, and play by the book. And therefore, with limitations that my colleague has touched on. Not taking bold moves in terms of the rich minerals and the mineral boom that we saw, the lack of beneficiations of that, and ensure that you stop exporting jobs. So you continue a country that has had more than a century with massive minerals. We still send those minerals in their raw form. And therefore, I think the lack of expanding opportunity in new areas. And I think there has been so much concentration on limited white-owned business ventures, the lack of expanding, for instance, the blue economy, and ensure that you bring in more and more blacks in new sectors. And that, I think, has been a major failure on the part of the government.
Prince Mandela, I want to get your thoughts here on the missed opportunities and whether you feel that South Africa has lived up to the promise of a post-apartheid dawn.
If you have a group of people who were previously oppressed, that is the black majority, there are certain things that you need to do as a government that seeks to develop them. Give them skills. In other words, give them top skills so that they can participate as skilled human beings in the economy. The ANC has largely failed to do so. Number two, you need to develop among them a group of industrialists who are going to set up economic projects, firms that are going to create value and create employment at the same time. Those black people who have become, few by the way, black people have become millionaires, are politically connected, but they have added almost nothing to the growth of the economy. They have been co-opted by rich white people. So black people have not been able to create employment for themselves. So the economic policies of the ANC has actually not, one, expanded the economy. It has not produced skills. It has produced a small middle class, but a black middle class. But in the main, if you look at the black middle class that have been produced by the government, are people who are working for the state, civil servants, are actually not people who are producing value in the private sector. So that has been the major failure on the part of the government.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, let's take a short break. And when we return, we will continue our conversation on the past 30 years of democracy in South Africa, its current state, and the hopes for its future. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Chris Hatting, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis, Professor David Monyai, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, and Prince Mashele, Executive Director, Center for Politics and Research. Prince Mashele, the World Bank describes South Africa as the most unequal society on earth, with an unemployment rate of about 44.5% among young individuals. What are your views on inequality and that perception of South Africa as the most unequal society in the world?
This gap has been widened, mainly because the government of South Africa over the past 30 years has failed to skill black people. If you look at the concentration of skills in our society, in the main, it is mainly white people who are skilled, have access to quality education. So as a result, you see this widening gap between those who are skilled and those who have access to economic opportunities, and the majority of black people who are unskilled and who are unemployed. If you don't fix the quality of your education, you can give them access. In other words, you can give black people access, but if the quality is bad, you are not going to bridge the gap between whites and blacks. That's what explains this failure to bridge the gap, is because black people have not been given good education, and therefore they are unable to be absorbed by the advanced sectors of our economy.
Right. Chris, your take on that labor divide as the biggest contributor to this persistent inequality. Are there other issues?
We touched a little bit earlier on the sort of size of the public sector wage bill. If it's more difficult for private sector economic activity to occur, if you've got onerous regulations, but also if you've got constraints like electricity, logistics, for example, well, those things increase the costs of trying to run and start a business. So only those with access to more resources, those with access to more skills, high levels of education, they can deal with those constraints better than the majority. For the majority of people struggling to access financing, so there's questions around what sort of impositions there are from your banks and requirements. So there's various constraints and issues which artificially raise the cost of trying to enter different markets and I think concentrate your various sectors. So the established players can do well, they've got the connections, they can navigate the bottlenecks, but for others, they find it much more difficult to start up new businesses, to employ not just themselves, but to employ others, to create more jobs, to upskill people, and just try and provide a bit more vibrant, I think, and dynamic economy. There is still substantive economic activity. I don't want to discount that. The informal economy in South Africa, I think, plays a very large and important role. But of course, that then doesn't come with your sort of job security, your long-term stability. There's lots of volatility in that regard. So then you ask questions about whether that is sustainable really over the long term or not.
Right. So if we look back 30 years, Professor Munyai, what do you see as the critical turning points that South Africa could have handled differently for better outcomes?
It all boils down to the need for a developmental state, a state that can expand infrastructure within South Africa and work extremely hard with the private sector, civil society, and ensure that you expand opportunities in so many other areas. A reversal apartheid of some sort. I think we had your Bantu states, and as it stands, opportunities in those former Bantu states still remain the same. And you still have massive number of people moving from rural to urban areas. And I think with the digital economy and the innovative way of ensuring that you limit the number of people moving into urban areas and opportunities should be created in those former Bantu states. I think there hasn't been much work. I mean, the ANC has done extremely well, with all fairness, in 30 years. However, I think more work is needed. Also expanding, looking beyond South Africa itself, with 60, 61, 62 million people. Yes, it's a big economy, but at a global level, it's still a small economy. And therefore, I think there is a need for South Africa to really expand opportunities beyond its own borders, working at SADC level and ensure that neighboring countries empower the economy, with their own economies, but regionally to have more than 300 million people, and better trade with bigger powers such as China, United States, and Europe. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think going forward, next 30 years, South Africa is required to really look beyond its own borders.
So, Professor Munyai, on that thought of South Africa expanding outside its borders, what do you think about its role in global diplomacy?
I think South Africa has done extremely well. Firstly, I think it has moved the country from isolation and apartheid, inward looking and limited and perceived as part of the Western world, into a much more Afrocentric foreign policy defined by the then President Thabo Mbeki, and therefore identifying itself as an African and African voice. Within international platforms, South Africa has done extremely well working with the continent itself and working with Global South in dealing with issues in platforms such as the non-alignment movement, the G77 plus China. I think it has worked extremely hard within WTO and other UN agencies to strengthen multilateralism, as well as demand for transformation of these institutions to be more democratic and to be much more inclusive in terms of bringing in the majority in the Global South, transparent of these institutions, and head on outstanding global issues, conflicts particularly such as Palestinian and Israeli, becoming a really good voice of legitimizing these institutions, particularly the ICC, as well as the criminal court, the ICJ, the case that is we confront now. And therefore, I think the international community still sees South Africa as an important voice from the African continent.
Right. So I'm going to take your final comments, and let me start off with you, Chris, as you project on South Africa into the future. What are the key lessons learned from the past 30 years of democracy in South Africa? And can South Africa correct the fundamentals that you've all been talking about that are causing the current challenges?
I think there are always numerous opportunities to correct course. It's not to say that things will be solved overnight, but you've got a vigorous civil society, vigorous democratic process, a governing party that I think fundamentally respects democracy, the transition of power, and would want to do justice to their legacy that they earned over many years. So I think regardless of this particular election outcome, it's always important to keep an eye on longer term trends. Where is investment going? What particular sectors are changing? If one can continue in some broad direction with your developmental state idea, but you also look at regulations and other policy, macro policies that constrain economic activity, that increase prices, that make transformative economic activity more difficult, and try and address those where possible through your various government departments, but also in partnership with the private sector and with civil society. Try and devolve power a little bit more to the provinces, to your local municipalities, to those individuals who on the ground deal with their particular issues. In KwaZulu-Natal, in Cape Town, in the Free State, there are different challenges and different local issues, which I think if you can get people's buy-in, get them to buy into the idea that they're the agents of democracy, then I think you can make quite substantial progress. So it is a long-term project, but there is much reason to be hopeful and optimistic. If one doesn't adequately address those, of course, then you, over time, break down the sort of trust in democracy and you open up the possibility of more sort of populist movements over the long term. That brings its own risks. I don't think we're there just yet, but I think we still have time and opportunity on our side.
Prince Mandela, you talked a lot about the labor divide getting wider. So can South Africa be able to correct the fundamentals that are causing that?
Yes, because we know what is wrong. What is wrong is that our public schools are run badly, and the quality of products it produces it's very bad. So South Africa going forward, it needs to focus on improving the quality of public education, because then you can produce skills that can be absorbed by an advanced modern economy. That's number one. Number two, it needs, as I said earlier on, to change the structure of its economy. It must start beneficiating its mineral resources, reduce the level of exports in terms of natural resources going outside, but beneficiating them locally so that the country produces value. If you do that, you are going to grow the economy. You are also going to create jobs for the unemployed. I think that should be the main focus for South Africa over the next 30 years. Politically, the country has done well. It is an open democracy. It's one of the best democracies in the world, I would argue.
Right. Professor Munyaya, your final thoughts?
I think the state of democracy and body politics in South Africa is in good health. 30 years is a limited time. There have been a lot of teething problems, and my prediction is that we're going to see ANC coming back into power with a limited number of votes than previous election, but nonetheless able to carry governance matters and really change some of the fundamentals that my colleagues has alluded to.
All right, gentlemen, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Chris Hattingh, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis, Professor David Munyaya, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, and Prince Mandela, Executive Director, Center for Politics and Research. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.